Sometimes, heroism comes from the most unexpected places. In a moment of life or death, a homeless black man stepped up to save a billionaire's son, and what happened next left everyone in shock. The wind howled through the empty streets as Andre tightened his worn-out coat around his shoulders, bracing against the biting cold. Life had never been kind to him, but he had learned to endure. Each day was a battle for survival, a struggle to find shelter, warmth, and a little dignity in a world that barely acknowledged his existence. Yet despite his hardships, his heart remained strong, shaped by the many trials he had endured. Andre had learned that compassion was the only thing that truly separated people. Not wealth, not power, not status, but the ability to see and help another human being in need. Far away from the unforgiving city streets Andre called home, a luxurious mountain resort stood high in the snow-covered peaks, a retreat for the wealthy who sought adventure and exclusivity. It was a world so far removed from his own that he could barely imagine it. A place where the privileged dined in warmth, unaware of what it meant to go hungry for days. But fate had a way of intertwining lives in the most unexpected moments. That morning, the sky above the mountains had been clear, the sun glistening over untouched snow. Families laughed, skiers carved smooth trails down the pristine slopes, and inside the grand resort, guests sipped hot chocolate by the fire, sheltered from the cold. Among them was Jason, a young boy no older than 8, the son of a ruthless businessman who had built his empire on power and greed. The world had been handed to Jason on a silver platter, and though he had never known struggle, he had also never known the warmth of true kindness. Then the storm came. Without warning, dark clouds swallowed the peaks, bringing an unrelenting blizzard. The wind roared as snow piled high, and visibility was lost in a matter of minutes. Panic spread through the resort as the sudden storm trapped skiers on the slopes, cut off communication lines, and turned what had been a paradise into a frozen nightmare. And then, with a deafening crack, the mountainside gave way. A wall of ice and snow came roaring down, swallowing everything in its path. Trees snapped like twigs, cabins crumbled beneath the weight, and people ran for their lives. But there was no escaping nature's wrath. Within moments, an avalanche had buried parts of the resort in a suffocating blanket of white. Some managed to make it to safety, but many were lost beneath the crushing weight of snow. The rescue efforts were slow, hampered by the ongoing storm, and the sheer devastation left in the avalanche's wake. The world outside watched in horror as news of the disaster spread, but for those trapped beneath the ice, time was running out. Buried deep in the wreckage was Jason. His cries were muffled by the thick layers of snow, his small body shivering violently as the cold seeped into his bones. His father, unable to reach him, stood helplessly above the wreckage, barking orders to the rescuers, his wealth and power suddenly meaningless in the face of nature's fury. Desperation set in, but hope was fading with each passing second. And then, in the midst of the chaos, Andre arrived. He had been wandering, as he always did, searching for shelter when he stumbled upon the edge of the disaster. Unlike the others, he had no reason to be there, no family to worry about, no wealth to lose. But when he heard the faint cry of a child carried by the wind, he knew he couldn't walk away. Others hesitated, unsure of what to do, reluctant to risk their own safety. They had their own concerns, their own priorities, but Andre didn't hesitate. To him, a cry for help was not something to be ignored, no matter who it came from. As the storm raged on, he made a choice that would change everything. The biting wind cut through Andre's thin jacket as he walked through the empty streets, his hands stuffed into his pockets for warmth. Life had never been easy for him, and the cold only served as another reminder of how little the world cared for people like him. Each day was a battle, finding food, searching for a place to sleep, and navigating a world that treated him like he didn't exist. People passed him by without a second glance, their eyes deliberately avoiding his as if acknowledging his presence would somehow taint their own existence. Andre hadn't always been homeless. There was a time when he had dreams, a time when he had a future ahead of him. But circumstances had a way of unraveling everything, and before he knew it, he had lost the stability he once took for granted. Yet, despite the hardships, he had never let bitterness consume him. He had seen cruelty and neglect firsthand, and rather than allow it to harden his heart, it had only strengthened his resolve to be different. He may not have had much, but what he did have, his compassion, his humanity, he held on to with all his might. In stark contrast, Jason's world was one of excess and indulgence. The young boy had never known hunger, never had to wonder where he would sleep at night. His life had been a series of lavish vacations, expensive toys, and the finest clothes money could buy. His father, Richard Caldwell, was one of the wealthiest businessmen in the country, a man who had built his empire on cutthroat deals and ruthless ambition. To him, money was power, and those who had none were simply a burden on society. Jason had been raised with this ideology, though he was too young to fully understand the weight of his father's beliefs. He had been taught that success was measured by wealth, and that those who struggled simply hadn't worked hard enough. It was an easy lesson to accept when he had never known hardship himself. In his world, problems were solved with a phone call, and inconveniences were smoothed over with money. He had never considered what life was like for people like Andre because, to him, they were invisible. But fate had a cruel way of leveling the playing field. When the Avalanche struck the remote mountain resort where Jason and his father were vacationing, the world of luxury and control that Richard had built for himself shattered in an instant. The force of the snow was unstoppable, burying everything in its path. The Grand Lodge, the heated walkways, the illusion of invincibility, it all crumbled beneath nature's wrath. Panic spread like wildfire as people scrambled for safety, but amidst the chaos, Jason became separated from his father. The weight of the snow pressed down on him, his small body trapped in the frozen grip of the avalanche. He had never known fear like this before. He had never known helplessness. For the first time in his life, he was truly alone, and no amount of money could change that. Richard stood above the wreckage, his face pale as he barked orders at the rescue teams. He had always believed that his wealth could solve any problem, but now, as he watched men dig frantically through the snow, with no guarantee that his son was even alive, he felt powerless. It was then that Andre arrived at the scene. He had been walking near the edge of the resort, searching for shelter, when he heard the distant shouts. The moment he realized what had happened, he moved toward the disaster without hesitation. Others hesitated, their own fears holding them back, but not Andre. He had spent his life surviving in the face of impossible odds. He understood struggle better than anyone. And now, as the world around him stood frozen in shock, he knew he couldn't stand idly by. As the blizzard continued to rage, the stark differences between Andre and Jason's lives became painfully clear. One had lived in privilege, the other in hardship. One had been raised to look down on men like Andre, while the other had spent his life being dismissed by people like Jason's father. Yet in this moment, none of that mattered. Because while the world saw Andre as a man of no importance, he was about to prove that a person's worth was not defined by wealth, but by the courage of their heart. The wind howled mercilessly as the avalanche thundered down the mountainside, swallowing everything in its path. The once pristine, snow-covered resort had transformed into a chaotic nightmare. People screamed, scrambling to escape the onslaught of snow and ice. Some ran toward the lodge, others huddled together in fear. But no one seemed to have control over the disaster unfolding before them. Andre had seen many disasters in his lifetime, personal, emotional, and financial, but nothing compared to the raw, untamed force of nature he was witnessing now. His heart pounded against his ribs as he took in the devastation. Then, through the chaos, he heard something that made his breath catch. A cry. It was faint, muffled beneath layers of snow, but it was there. Andre's instincts kicked in. Without hesitation, he pushed forward, his feet sinking into the deepening snow as he made his way toward the sound. The cries grew weaker, barely audible over the wind, but he refused to lose focus. His hands, numb from the cold, clawed at the snow, his breath coming out in short, sharp bursts. He had no idea who he was saving. It didn't matter. His fingers scraped against fabric. He froze, then dug faster, his desperation mounting. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he uncovered a small body. A child, pale, frozen, barely breathing. Jason. Andre didn't know the boy's name. He didn't know that the child in his arms belonged to a man who would never have given him a second glance under normal circumstances. All he knew was that Jason was dying, and he was the only one who could stop it. He pulled Jason from the snow and held him close, shielding him from the bitter cold. The boy's lips were turning blue, his small frame trembling violently. Andre moved as fast as his tired legs would carry him, trudging through the knee-deep snow toward safety. His body ached, his lungs burned, but he didn't stop. Behind him, onlookers gasped in shock. They watched as the man they had ignored, the man they had passed by on the streets without a second thought, emerged from the storm with the millionaire's son in his arms. Richard Caldwell, the boy's father, stood frozen, his expensive coat flapping in the wind. His entire life had been built on wealth and power, on the belief that status determined worth. And now, in the most pivotal moment of his life, the person saving his son was the one he had always deemed invisible. Andre didn't wait for thanks. He didn't care for recognition. He just needed to get the boy warm, to keep him alive. With every step, the weight of exhaustion threatened to pull him down, but he pushed through. He would not fail this child. By the time he reached the main lodge, paramedics were waiting. They rushed forward, carefully taking Jason from his arms and laying him on a stretcher. Andre stood back, watching as they worked, his body shaking from exertion and cold. The world around him blurred. The millionaire, the shocked faces of the guests, the flashing lights, it all faded into the background. All that mattered was that the boy was alive. The storm had passed, but the impact of what had just happened remained like an unshakable weight in the air. Inside the warmth of the lodge, Jason lay bundled in thick blankets, his tiny frame still trembling from the cold. The paramedics worked methodically, checking his vitals, ensuring that his body temperature was stabilizing. His father, Richard Caldwell, stood to the side, his face pale, his hands gripping the arms of his expensive coat as though it was the only thing grounding him. He watched in stunned silence as his son, his only child, took slow, steady breaths. Jason was alive, and the man responsible for that was standing a few feet away, shivering, his clothes soaked through with melting snow. Andre stood awkwardly, as if unsure what to do now that his job was done. His body ached, exhaustion settling deep into his bones. He was used to people ignoring him, pretending he didn't exist. But right now, in this moment, all eyes were on him. For the first time in years, he wasn't invisible. Richard exhaled sharply, his mind racing. Everything he had ever believed about class, about status, about people like Andre, had been shattered in an instant. He had built his entire life on the idea that people with wealth and power were the only ones who mattered, that success was a measure of worth. But now, staring at the man who had risked his life to save Jason, he felt something foreign creeping into his chest. Guilt. He had walked past men like Andre 100 times before, never sparing them more than a glance. He had dismissed them as failures, as burdens on society. He had even spoken about them in broad, cruel strokes. People like them should just work harder. They choose this life. But today, the man he had ignored, the man he would never have invited into his home, was the reason his son was still breathing. The realization hit him like a gut punch. The murmurs in the room grew louder. Reporters had arrived, their cameras flashing, their microphones extended. The story was already spreading. A homeless man had saved the son of one of the wealthiest men in the country. The headlines would be everywhere. Richard could see it already. But for the first time, he didn't care about the optics. He stepped forward, his movements slow, hesitant. His voice, when he spoke, was hoarse. "You saved my son." Andre blinked, startled by the directness. He shifted uncomfortably. "Yeah." His voice was rough, tired. He needed help. Richard swallowed, struggling with the words. Words that had never felt natural coming from his lips. "Thank you," he said, and the weight of it nearly knocked him over. Andre gave a tired nod. Anyone would have done the same. But that wasn't true. Richard knew it. Not everyone would have braved an avalanche for a stranger. Not everyone would have risked their life for a child that wasn't their own. A lump formed in Richard's throat. He turned to face the cameras, to the reporters waiting for a statement. For once, he wasn't thinking about PR strategies or financial gains. He was thinking about the man who had saved his child. He was thinking about how wrong he had been. Richard cleared his throat, his voice stronger now. "I've spent my life believing that wealth is what defines a person," he admitted, the words bitter on his tongue. "But today, I learned that true value isn't measured in money or status. It's measured in character." The reporters whispered among themselves, their cameras capturing every word. Richard turned back to Andre. "You've shown me something I didn't think was possible. You've changed the way I see the world." Andre just stood there, his tired eyes searching Richard's face for signs of insincerity. But for once, the billionaire wasn't putting on a show. He meant every word. "I don't know how to repay you," Richard continued, glancing at Jason, then back at Andre. "But I know I need to do something. Not just for you, but for every person I've turned my back on." A pause. Then, in front of the cameras, in front of the world, Richard Caldwell made a decision that would change the course of his life. "I'm pledging a portion of my wealth to help those in need, to provide housing, jobs, education, resources that I once believed were undeserved." His voice softened. I was wrong." The room fell silent. Andre exhaled, shaking his head with a half-smile. "Didn't do it for all that," he muttered, rubbing his arms against the cold. "Just saw a kid who needed help." Richard nodded, a small, tired smile tugging at his lips. "Maybe that's why it means so much." As the reporters fired off questions and the world took in the billionaire's unexpected transformation, Andre remained exactly as he had been before, humble, quiet, and strong. But now, for the first time in his life, someone was finally listening. The world around Andre had shifted overnight. He had always been invisible, just another homeless man in a city that refused to see him. But now he was everywhere, on television screens, in newspapers, on social media. His name was spoken with admiration, his face recognized by people who just days before would have crossed the street to avoid him. Andre, the forgotten man, was now a hero. A new beginning. For the first time in years, Andre had a place to sleep that wasn't a park bench or a shelter floor. Richard Caldwell had made good on his word, ensuring that Andre had a safe home, warm meals, and opportunities he had never imagined. But what mattered most to Andre wasn't the money or the praise. It was the respect. People no longer looked through him. When they passed him on the street, they nodded, they smiled. Strangers stopped to thank him, some offering handshakes, others simply saying, "You saved that boy's life. You're a good man." He wasn't sure he would ever get used to it. Sitting in a small but comfortable apartment, Andre watched the news as reporters continued to cover his story. The headline at the bottom of the screen read, "From Homeless to Hero, the man who saved a billionaire's son." He shook his head, muttering, "Wasn't about all that." But he couldn't deny that his life had changed. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. When he opened it, Richard Caldwell stood there, holding something in his hands, a framed certificate. "You're officially part of the Caldwell Foundation," Richard said, handing it to him. "A program dedicated to helping people like you, people who deserve a second chance." Andre hesitated before taking it. He ran his fingers over the smooth frame, his throat tightening. "I never asked for this." "I know," Richard said. "That's what makes you the right person for it." Changing the narrative. The community that had once turned a blind eye to Andre's struggles was now forced to reckon with their indifference. The same people who had ignored him on the sidewalks, who had assumed he was lazy or dangerous, were now rethinking everything. His story had reached beyond the billionaire's family. It had touched an entire city. News outlets ran specials on homelessness, discussing the realities that people like Andre faced every day. Community groups launched initiatives to provide better resources for those in need. Shelters saw an increase in donations. Andre's story had become a symbol of change. At a local town hall event, Richard invited Andre to speak. The crowd fell silent as he stepped up to the podium, his hands gripping the edges of the stand. He had never been much for speeches, but as he looked out at the audience, people who had once ignored him, now hanging on his every word, he knew he had to say something. "I was never looking to be a hero," he started, his voice steady. "I just saw a kid who needed help, and I did what anyone should have done." He glanced at Richard, then at Jason, the boy whose life he had saved, sitting in the front row. "The truth is, I shouldn't have had to be a hero just to be seen," Andre continued. "I was here before all of this. I was always here. People just chose not to look." The silence in the room was heavy. People shifted in their seats, uncomfortable with the truth of his words. "But now you see me," Andre said, his voice unwavering. And I hope you start seeing everyone else, too. A ripple effect. Andre's story inspired change far beyond what he had expected. The Caldwell Foundation expanded, creating housing and employment programs for those experiencing homelessness. Other billionaires and business leaders followed suit, pledging money to causes they had ignored for years. Schools began teaching students about empathy, about privilege, about the importance of seeing people beyond their circumstances. Andre himself took an active role in the foundation, helping others who had been overlooked just as he once was. He worked with shelters, met with struggling families, and used his voice to make sure people like him were never invisible again. He never wanted fame. He never wanted attention. But he had wanted dignity. And now, for the first time in his life, he had it. A new legacy Richard Caldwell, the billionaire who once prided himself on wealth and power, had found a new purpose. He wasn't just known as the CEO of a corporation anymore. He was the man who had been changed by the very person he once ignored. And Jason, his son, would grow up knowing that wealth wasn't what made a person valuable. He would remember the day a man with nothing gave him everything. The impact of one selfless act had spread like ripples in water, and at the center of it all was Andre, not just a man who had saved a life, but a man who had changed the world. CTA, Resolution Section. Jamal's heroism proved that courage can come from anyone, no matter their background. Have you ever witnessed a story that made you rethink your assumptions about others? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The world had moved on from the Avalanche, but its impact remained. Andre's name had become synonymous with courage. The story of the homeless man who saved a billionaire's son was more than just a headline. It was a lesson in humanity. Andre never saw himself as a hero. He had spent years unseen, unnoticed, another face in the crowd that people passed without a second thought. But now, the world couldn't look away. People who had once ignored him now greeted him with respect. The same city that had overlooked him now held him in the highest regard. His story had reached beyond the snowy mountains, inspiring thousands, even millions, to reconsider how they viewed the people they so easily dismissed. But to Andre, none of that mattered as much as the simple fact that Jason was alive. Richard Caldwell, the man who had once prided himself on wealth and exclusivity, had changed in ways he never thought possible. He had built his fortune believing that status and money were the true measures of a man. But now, standing beside Andre, he understood how wrong he had been. He had almost lost his son, and the man he had once looked down upon had saved him. That realization had shattered everything Richard thought he knew about the world. He had spent years accumulating wealth, but in a single moment, Andre had shown him something more valuable than money: selflessness, humanity, and the power of doing the right thing simply because it was right. In the months following the avalanche, Richard poured his resources into initiatives that provided shelter, education, and employment for the homeless. He worked alongside Andre, listening and learning, using his influence to bring real change. But more than that, he became a different father to Jason, one who now taught his son that strength was not in power but in kindness. Andre's story didn't just change one man, it changed an entire city. News stations covered his journey, using his name as a symbol of resilience and compassion. Donations poured into shelters, programs were created, and people who had once turned a blind eye now found themselves asking, "How can I help?" The ripple effect was undeniable. The same park benches where Andre had once slept now had outreach workers offering food, warmth, and hope to others in need. The faces of the ignored were finally being seen, and at the center of it all was Andre. One selfless act had reshaped lives. Andre didn't ask for fame, nor did he seek gratitude. He had done what he knew in his heart was right, and in doing so, he had proven that heroism isn't about wealth, status, or recognition. It's about action. As he stood on the stage at a city event months later, where he was being honored for his bravery, he didn't prepare a grand speech. Instead, he looked out at the crowd, at Jason, at Richard, at the faces that now saw him as more than just a man without a home, and simply said, "I was always here. You just never saw me before." The silence that followed carried more weight than any applause, because everyone knew he was right. Andre's heroic actions not only saved a life, but sparked a ripple of change that reached far beyond the snow-covered mountains. His bravery proved that the power of compassion can melt even the coldest of hearts. This story reminds us all that no matter how tough life gets, kindness and courage can break through barriers and create lasting change. Andre's legacy will inspire generations to come, teaching us that heroism knows no boundaries.